So we continuing on in our series today of the final week, which is, so what's today? Friday. For those of you who are visiting, we've been doing a series on the final week, and so each Sunday, we've been looking at a different day of the final week, and so we are to Friday. Next Sunday, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be celebrating what day? Sunday. So that tells you in your brain, all right, well, I guess we are missing a day of the week. Well, never fear, we're going to be talking about Saturday on Friday. So I know, go crazy, right? So we had our Good Friday service, and you're not going to want to miss it, but we're going to be talking about Saturday, what happened on Saturday? More than what you think. All right? So I need you to come back out, Good Friday service, 7 o'clock here. It's going to be great. I love Good Friday service because it's the perfect bookend, in my opinion, to Sunday morning. And so you got Good Friday, and the Sunday morning is it just says the week. So anyway, so today, though, is Friday. Last week, I told you about two Greek words that measure time. And if you remember, okay, so those of you who may be here last week, the A students among you, how many of you remember one of the Greek words for time? Chronos, all right? Probably because, isn't he like a Avenger? Maybe not, I don't know. Is he an Avenger? No, probably not. All right. I know that Chronos, whatever you would say that. I say Chronos, that's what I say. But anyway, I've been told that he's a Greek god or something about, anyway, I'm beyond my pay grade at this point. He's the time god. Thank you for those of you who pay attention to that. Thank you. So Chronos or Chronos, whatever, that would be the time god. So it's that god that measures, it's the word that measures time in terms of hours and minutes and seconds and milliseconds and whatever else. It's the measurement of time. But there was another Greek word, because so often we think of Chronos as time. But there's another Greek word. Let's see, this is the one not as popular. Does anybody remember what the other Greek word was for time? It's the word kairos. The word kairos. Whereas whereas chronos measures time, kairos measures moments in time. Like I talked about last week, you can have a bunch of time, but nothing that's very memorable. But kairos is that which measures that moment in time that is measurable, that is memorable. And so when the gospel writers were writing their sections here, oftentimes their stuff seems like all over the place. Certain things are here, certain things are there. How does it all fit together? And it seems like they disagree with each other so often, because to the Hebrew mind, kairos was way more important than chronos. And so our question even begs this today, and that is, are we celebrating Friday? Or are we celebrating Thursday today? You see, what we're celebrating is what we think of as the final day, the day of Jesus' crucifixion. There are many, many smart people who tend to think that Jesus was crucified on Thursday. Technically, I think my leaning is towards this. But because when it comes to the whole thing of Good Friday, it comes to all the celebrations and stuff, trust me, it's not worth it. So that's why we're still celebrating it on Friday, but I think you could make a case that Jesus was probably crucified on Thursday instead. But for the sake of everything, we're celebrating it as Friday today. And one of the things that we're going to see as we go through this whole thing is the word injustice. I've entitled my message this morning, Oh, the Injustice. How many of you can think back to a time, maybe even this past week, in which there was some sort of injustice that you saw, that you heard about, maybe that you experienced yourself? Maybe it was somebody who accused you of something that you didn't do, and yet they were treating you poorly because you didn't even do it, and yet they're somehow accusing you of it, and you're like, oh, the injustice. Maybe it's a scenario that you saw, maybe that you heard about. I heard about a person just yesterday, and this person was driving through Grand Rapids, And a homeless man steps out in front of him. Who knows why steps out in front of him, but he hits the man. Somehow through the course of everything, I don't know the whole story, but somehow through the course of everything, this man who hit him ends up in jail for 10 months. And you're sitting there going, how does this even happen? And yet I've witnessed it numerous times. There are times even in our court system where it seems as if a person is guilty until proven innocent rather than innocent until proven guilty. And we hear about this and we go, oh, the injustice. Maybe it was a sideways glance that you're like, how dare they look at me this way? Whatever the situation, there's something inside of us from the littlest of kid that knows what's fair and what's not fair, isn't there? And when we don't feel like something is fair, there are all the alarms and the bells that are going off saying, no, this is not right and I won't stand for it. And I can't help but as we look at our story today, as we look at the events that took place on that Friday or Thursday, the words, oh, the injustice just comes out. And so my sermon this morning is going to be a little bit different. Really what we're going to do today is just we're going to walk, and I'm going to tell the story. And I'm not going to give you the sermon until the very end. Because I want the text to just speak. And hopefully what it does is it gives you a much greater understanding of what Jesus went through that final day before his crucifixion and the day of his crucifixion. Because he was willing to be unjustly treated for you and for me. How much do we struggle with the willingness to be unjustly treated for the sake of something bigger like Jesus Christ? And hopefully this inspires us today. And so with that, I want you to turn in your Bibles to Luke 22. Luke 22. Luke 22. As you're going there, I'm going to give you a map, and we're going to be walking through with this map. You're going to see this thing over and over again, because what I wanted you to see is I want you to get a picture of Jerusalem. Now, how many of you, maybe you have your Bibles or something, if you understand a little bit of what Israel looks like, it's kind of a long, slender, narrow country, and Jerusalem is about 2/3 of the way down within this country. If my memory serves me correctly, Israel is about 1/8 the size of the state of Michigan. So it gives you a sense. This is not a big place, okay? It's not a big place, and yet it is an incredibly strategic place because you have the Mediterranean Sea on the west side, and you've got really formidable desert on the east side. And so if you were traveling between Egypt, Babylon, all of these countries, you will definitely go through Israel. It's kind of the center of the world over there. And so even though it's very small, it's an incredibly important location. And so when God says, this will be the land where I want my people to dwell, this is the land where I will put my name, it doesn't mean it's a big land. It means it's a strategic land. And so the city of Jerusalem is, like, as I said, about 2/3 of the way down in the lower third. It's right at the very top of the lower third in a region called Judea. But Jerusalem in Jesus' time looked somewhat like this. Now, I want you to see this. It's not very big, so hopefully you get a sense of this. This area is about 1 square mile. So if you think about it like this, if you know your local area a little bit, if I drive down to Clyde Park, and then I go to Burlingame, that's about 1 mile, and then I go up to 76th Street, that's about 1 mile. So this whole area fits between, say, Clyde Park and Burlingame, 84th Street and 76th Street. That gives you the sense of how big this is. There's a little thing at the very bottom. You can see the compass points north, okay? Right next to it, that thing, and probably you can't see it, but it says 500 feet. So you get a sense, this is not a very large place, okay? Back in Jesus' time, probably, as I said, probably about 25,000 people lived here. full-time year-round, but this number would swell into the hundreds of thousands whenever there would be festivals that would take place. And so during Passover, during the various feasts, whether in the fall, Feast of Tabernacles, whatever it was, there was a lot of people who would come. But as far as like who lived here full-time, not very much. Now you also have to realize there were the suburbs, there were the rich area, there was the poor people area in the city of Jerusalem. And probably some of the richest section was what was known as the upper city. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see where it says the upper city. If you were in the lower city, that was still a relatively wealthy area. If you were poor, you lived in the region between, which was a little valley that came down. And so there were certainly places you wanted to live in Jerusalem, and then there were places you didn't. But I wanted you to get a sense of the place. Temple Mount was the thing. It's what made Jerusalem, especially in the time of Jesus, because of a man by the name of Herod the Great, who built the temple to be this massive structure. They say about 11 football fields could fit in the Temple Mount area, right there in that area. It's a very big area. And so everything kind of centered around the temple. But I want you to get the sense, because when we left off last week, this is where we were. We were in the upper room where they were celebrating the Last Supper. Jesus was here. And so in this place, he would have met with his disciples. They would have celebrated what we now know today as the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper or communion, what we would say there. But probably there is some discrepancy whether or not he actually celebrated the Passover meal or whether it was a modification of it. We don't know. All we know is that this is where and by the way, what I'm showing you is this traditional understanding of where these places are. But traditional understanding, this is where Jesus was at. And he would have come from this area over here, okay? For those of you looking this way, he would have come from this area. This is to Bethphage and Bethany. This is the Mount of Olives right down through here, okay? So it gives you the sense of where this is at. This is the Mount of Olives right through there, okay? So this is where we find Jesus. This is where we left off on Thursday or Wednesday, depends on which day it is. So there we are, and now Jesus leaves there and he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. He probably walks out one of the gates right at the edge of the upper city, down through the Tyropean Valley, through the lower city, and makes his way down the Kidron Valley up to the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's there, probably on the way, that he teaches his disciples about the vine and the branches. He does the high priestly prayer, John 17, and then he ends up in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where we pick up here in Luke chapter 22. Jesus went out, verse 39, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples follow him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in an anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." If we go right to verse 47, it says, "While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them." If you read in the other gospel accounts, we find out that Jesus didn't just find his disciples sleeping one time. He found them sleeping 3 times. He goes away, he spends time in prayer, they come back, and he's like, "Why are you sleeping?" And they're like, I was tired, I don't know. They don't realize the significance of what's happening. Jesus goes back again. He comes back. "Why were you sleeping?" "I'm sorry, I'm just tired. I'm sorry it's late." And he goes away again. And this whole time, Jesus is so aware of what's coming. He knows that his crucifixion is imminent. I can't even imagine what that would be like, just knowing what's coming. That stress and the agony. One of the gospel writers say that he actually sweat drops of blood. Such stress that his blood, the capillaries were breaking and blood was coming out. This was just an easy thing. You know what it's like when you maybe hear from the doctor. You have a test done and the doctor says, "Hey, we found something on your CT scan. We found something in the x-ray. We need you to come back for some more testing." Or we found something and we think it may be cancer, but we got to have a biopsy on this. We're not sure. Whatever the situation is, you know that feeling that you have. You're like, what could it be? What could it be? It's not there yet. but you still feel it. And that's what's going on for Jesus. He was a man. Yes, he was God, but he was a man and he felt things. He felt pain just like us. And so this is where Jesus would spend one of his last years. This was about midnight. Just before midnight, he ends up here in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's there that he prays. And then about 1 o'clock, just after midnight, Judas shows up. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Now, why would this be significant? If you remember, the religious leaders wanted so bad to get Jesus. They wanted so bad. He had made them look like fools on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. He showed them what they truly were. They were greedy. They were all about holding power. That's what they were. And Jesus went right after them. And so they were waiting for the opportunity. But they didn't want to do it in front of everybody, because if they did it in the middle of the day, there were many people who believed he was their Messiah. And they would kill them. And so as a result, Judas knows, here's my shot. He knew it, and that's why he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But the religious leaders, they wouldn't be able to tell who Jesus was in the garden. It's dark. And yet Judas would clearly know who Jesus is. And so he led the group, and he walks right up to him, and he says, greetings, Rabbi. And Jesus says, basically, I know what you're here for. Go ahead and do it. And so this started some events. After this whole thing happened, you remember Peter sliced off the ear. Jesus says, no, we're not about this. And he puts the ear back on, and off he goes with them. Where does he go next? He actually ends up right over here. You can see, according to the traditional understanding, very near the upper room. He ends up at what was known as the house of Caiaphas. Now, his first trial was before a man by the name of Annas. Now, Annas was Caiaphas's father-in-law. Caiaphas was, if you remember the movie back from a number of years ago, The Godfather, Annas was kind of the godfather, okay? He was the one who had all the power, and he was the one who kind of directed the affairs. Caiaphas didn't do much without the approval of his father-in-law. And so Annas was the one who decides to meet with him first. Probably what was happening, Caiaphas was pulling together the Sanhedrin at this time, which was the ruling body of 71 members of Pharisees, Sadducees, elders. It was the ruling council. We would almost say the Supreme Court. And so while Caiaphas is doing this, Annas decides to have some time with him. And so Jesus, while there, Annas is asking him questions, and Jesus is responding very carefully, very calculatedly, which is interesting because as you think about it, think about what Jesus has in his brain. How many of you would be able to think clearly, knowing what's coming down the road? I think I would be freaking out. Probably all of us would. And yet Jesus is answering very calmly, very calculatedly. And while he was there, one of Annas' guards comes over and he slaps him, smacks him right in the face. Jesus says, why did you hit me? Basically, don't talk to Annas that way. Nobody talks to Annas this way. Jesus responds with, I did not realize he was the high priest. We go from there to actually have the next thing in which he has trial number 2, probably here at Caiaphas' house. There is some discrepancy as to whether or not he may have actually gone to the temple for the second trial, but more than likely he didn't go to the temple. More than likely he would have stayed right there in that house, because that's when Caiaphas comes out. Matthew and Mark actually tell us, Luke doesn't really explain much about this, but Matthew and Mark tell us that this is where Caiaphas was pulling all the false witnesses together. We're going to look at it in just a second, but there were rules that the religious leaders had to follow for this thing to be a fair trial, for this thing to be right. We're going to see it in just a second. There were 22 rules that the religious leaders broke that night by doing what they did to Jesus. Oh, the injustice. One of the things that they had to do was they had to have the witnesses agree, and if they disagreed, then they would not be allowed to be able to submit that in court. Well, they didn't care about that. They were looking for anything to stick. They were accusing him of this, accusing him of that. Finally, they thought maybe they got one. I think I heard him say he was going to tear the physical temple down in 3 days. Well, remember, Jesus says, I will take this temple down and I will raise it up again. Well, which temple was he talking about? He was talking about himself. And even then they couldn't agree. And finally, the question was asked, who are you? Tell us under oath, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus says, yes, it is as you say. And at that moment, the high priest, it says he rips his clothes and he says, blasphemy, blasphemy, we will not stand for this. And it was then that they sent him out and they began a beating. The temple guards, which would be here, now these would be the religious priests. Many of these probably would be Levites. And they would begin to beat him. All on the witnesses and the false testimonies. So what happens? I want to give you a couple things here. These were some of the rules. There's 22 rules. I'm going to only give you 5, but this is interesting. One of the ones was this. No trials were allowed on the eve of a Sabbath or a feast day. No trials were allowed. Basically, you had to wait. Well, what did the religious leaders do that night? Even though it was Passover that night, the Feast of Unleavened Bread the very next day, what did they do? We're still going to hold this thing. Because why? We want him dead. We don't care what's right and what's wrong. They're breaking their own rules. Number 2, no steps of criminal proceedings were to occur after sunset. When was all this happening? Middle of the night. This is 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. That's when all this is happening. Number 3, no secret trials. Only public trials were to be held at the temple. Why? So that people could see that this thing was handled fairly. Where was this trial being done? At Caiaphas' house. They didn't care. They didn't care about being just or right. They wanted him dead. The next one, in the case of capital punishment, the trial and the guilty verdict could not occur at the same time, but had to be separated by at least 24 hours. Why is that? One of the rules that was required was because they needed time to be able to gather evidence. Because if there could be evidence that could be brought forward to give witness to the accused, then they wanted to get him off. They wanted the ability to get him off, and yet in this particular case, not that way at all. Oh, he has a trial with Annas, and then he has a trial with Caiaphas, and right after that they say, you know what, we're killing you. Right after that, you deserve to die. The last one, a person condemned to death was not to be scourged or beaten before his execution. These were all their rules, and yet, what are we seeing throughout the text? They don't care. There's actually 17 more of them, but for the sake of time, I didn't want to give them to you. This came out of a book called Yeshua, which is a man by the name of Arnold Fruchtenbaum. He's a converted Jew, and it was interesting for him to read through some of this section. But man, we hear this and we're like, man, when you hear of somebody who's unjustly treated at a trial, we think that when it comes to a trial, there should be a fair judge, there should be a fair jury, there should be a fair justice punishment or pronouncement given. And when we see that doesn't take place, it just kills us. And yet one of the things that we read, and we'll see this in a little text later on, during this whole thing, it says, as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so Jesus didn't say a word. He was willing to be unjustly treated for you and for me. As we go on to here, after all this sham of a trial took place, they decide to take him to Pilate. By the way, it said, verse 52, then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him. I'm sorry, that was in the garden. I'm sorry, I mistake. One of the things I wanted to mention was he says right there at the end of verse 53, he says, but this is your hour when darkness reigns. I thought, what a telling statement that was. This is your hour. You think that you're in control. By the way, God is letting this happen to accomplish his purposes. My day will come. This is your hour. Basically, do what you're going to do. Peter disowns him. The guards mock him. And then we go on through. Remember, it says, before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. That's the whole thing with Peter. Well, when we come along, we're now sent up here to Pilate. Okay, so Jesus first appears before Pilate. He goes up here, by the way, when Pilate was in town. By the way, Pilate hated the Jews. He hated the Jews. He was the Roman governor at the time. He absolutely hated the Jews. He hated going and being around the Jews, and he especially hated being around the Jews at their feast days because there were many more of them. Pilate would normally live in a place called Caesarea, which was right on the coast, just kind of northwest of there. It was a very Roman area, and that's where he would live. But a couple times a year, he would come down because he had to keep the peace in Jerusalem, and he hated being there. But while he was there, he would stay in this Herod the Great's palace. Herod was the one who built the temple, and he died in 4 BC, 3 to 4 BC. And so Jesus is led there, and he goes up to Herod's place, goes up to the palace, and Pilate would stay in Herod the Great's place whenever he was in town. And so Pilate asked him the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" If you look in chapter 23, verses 2 through 7, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he says. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Verse 3, "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." Pilate says, "Here we are. We're here. I don't see any reason." He says he's the king of the Jews. I don't even care about the Jews. You can be the king. I don't care if you're the king of the Martians. I don't care. You be the king. If the Jews are unhappy with you, have at it. I want to let him go. Now let me go back to bed. Think about it. It's probably 5 o'clock in the morning by now. How much justice do you think is going to be done at 5 o'clock in the morning if you got woken up out of bed? Probably none. But there was something very interesting in verse 6. Verse 5, "But they insisted. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if this man was a Galilean. If you remember, the regions in Israel were Galilee to the north, Samaria in the middle, and Judea at the bottom. The Galileans were kind of the rednecks of the day. Okay, the Samaritans were the outcasts of the day. You were special if you lived in Judea. But when he said, "Oh, he's a Galilean," that's where he's from. Well, Pilate says, "Good, there's another guy who lives down the street. This is his jurisdiction. Let's send him over there. Let him deal with the Galilean." So he sends him down the street to a man by the name of Herod Antipas. So now we are right here at Pilate's house. So he sends him right around the corner to the Hasmonean palace. Remember, this is probably maybe 500, 750 feet away. We're not talking big places, but they lead him through the street. It's probably still nighttime. They wake up Herod at this point in time. Herod says, "Oh, goody, I've been wanting to meet this guy. I've been wanting to meet this guy. I've heard he's a miracle worker." And so Herod says, "Hey, can you work some miracles for me? Let's do it. Let's magic tricks, whatever else. I don't know what you got up your sleeve. Let's do this." And Jesus was not in the playing along mood at this point in time. And so finally, after Herod realizes, "I'm not going to get anywhere with this guy," he sends him away. And he says, "You know what? I want nothing to do with him." And he sends him back to Pilate's house. Pilate's like, "Great, I can't get rid of this guy." This man keeps showing up, and the religious leaders keep saying, "We want him dead, we want him dead." And Pilate's like, "Why? He only broke your law. I don't even care about your law. No, we want him dead. No, we want him dead." Well, this is about the time when there's a man by the name of Barabbas. I don't know if you remember that. Barabbas was the man who was scheduled to be dead. He was scheduled to be executed. And yet the Romans, once a year, they would say, "Okay, on a feast day, we will let go one of your prisoners." So they said, "Hey, how about we let go Jesus? I know he did these awful things in your mind, but let's all get along. Let's just take the charges away. Let's let the man go." And they say, "No." And he says, "Which would you rather have? Barabbas, who's a criminal, probably murdered many people? Do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus?" "We want Barabbas. We love that man." Whatever they're saying, we don't know. All they knew is they wanted Jesus dead. Oh, the injustice. What did Jesus even do? Nothing. And he goes to Pilate. Pilate has an idea. You know what? Maybe if I just punish him. Now in Roman days, it was a punishment and it was called flogging. The Jews had something called flogging, in which they would say 39 or 40 lashes minus 1. It was the 39 lashes. Now the flogging thing was a stick, and then it had kind of these hooks and stuff, bone pieces, fragments, and hooks on there. And they would do that. Well, there was a man, and he was a Roman guard. There was a group of 4 of them. And the one guy was in charge of it because his job was to make sure that the person didn't die. They wanted him as close to death as possible, but they didn't die. If the died, am I losing sound here? If the guy being punished died, then this guy's in trouble. So his job was just to make sure he didn't die, while the other guys are there to exact their justice. The issue, though, when it came to Jesus, it seems as if they liked it a little bit too much. Because they're not just exacting justice. In fact, what they said was they hit him and they hit him and they hit him and they hit him. But after they were done with this, that's the flogging. But after they were done with this, then they took this fancy robe and they put it on him. And then they took this crown of thorns. Some of these, the thorns, based on what we can tell from the text, these thorns were probably 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. And they wound this thing together and they jam it onto his head. And then it says they took the purple cloak, and then it says they had a staff, and they gave it to him. And they took the staff, and while he held the staff, then they bowed down, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then after they did that, then they took the staff back, and then they just beat him on the head. It says they hit him, and then they spit on him, and they laughed at him, and that's what they did. And this whole time, what's Jesus doing? He's simply taking it. It was interesting. We didn't read the section, but in Matthew, I believe it is, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas and the high priest and everybody came to get Jesus, if you remember, Peter takes his sword out and he cuts off the ear. Jesus says to him, "Put it back." He says, "Don't you realize if I asked the Father, he would send 12 legions of angels to be at my disposal? What chance do you think a group of people armed with swords and clubs would have against 12 legions of angels? None. And yet that's what Jesus did for you and for me. He humbled himself, and he took it. And he did it for us. Goes back to Pilate. While he's there, Pilate comes out. He's like, "Okay, listen, I punished him. Now, I want to let him go." And the people are like, "No, we want to crucify him. We want him crucified." And so sure enough, after the scourging, we then come to Pilate number 3. In Luke, we don't actually read this. We don't see this, but John tells us that after the scourging, Pilate goes to him and he says, "Listen, dude, let me tell you something here." He doesn't say, "Dude, it's in mine." But he says, listen, Jesus, I want to tell you something, okay? I want to tell you something. I need you to understand this. I have the power to let you go, and I also have the power to crucify you. You realize I have the power for this. Now think about it. Jesus has been beat by the religious leaders. He's probably exhausted after having no sleep, blood loss, everything else. I mean, he's at the point of death already. And Jesus turns to him and looks at him and he says, basically, "You have no power over me except that which is given to you." You can only imagine that Pilate at this point realizes, this ain't no ordinary man. And it says, the text tells us in John that Pilate at that point tried every which way to let him go. But the crowds were shouting even louder. They're shouting even louder. "We want him crucified. Crucify him. Crucify him. Crucify him." And so Pilate, after washing his hands, he basically says, "All right, the blood be in your hands." And they said, "Fine." He says, "Okay, he's your king of the Jews." And their response back to him was, "We have no king but Caesar." Can you imagine the religious leaders who were said to have no other gods before them? The religious leaders that night, what are they saying? They're saying, "We don't care. Crucify him. We're going to have no other God before us, and yet we worship Caesar as long as he gives us what we want." Oh, the injustice. At that point, that's where they would lead him away to be crucified. You could see it's not very far away. After the scourgings, after everything, there was a city wall. You could see it right around here. You could see the city wall. It says Jesus was led out of the city and he was crucified. Right on this here, this is the traditional site. Some sites actually have it coming up here to the top now, but this is the traditional site. Man, when we were over in Israel, they actually have a stone. I didn't have a good picture, else I would have shown it to you, but they actually have a stone. It's probably 8 feet long by maybe 3 feet wide. And then there's a thing around it. And according to church tradition, this is the stone where they would have laid Jesus to prepare him for crucifixion. And I'll tell you, it was a moving thing. You know, to walk up and put your hands there and you think, man, Jesus did this for me. What did he do for me? There is so much historical evidence to prove Jesus was real. There is so much historical evidence to prove that he died. There is so much historical evidence to prove that he rose again. And there are so many people who try to say Jesus was never real, or he was just a man, or resurrection never happened. Trust me, and you're going to want to stick around for the Bible class today because Will's going to be talking about this. There is historical proof Jesus did this for you, and the question is why? Because he loves you. Because he loves me. That's why. He did all of it. He was willing to do all of it for us. What's interesting is that as they would lead him through the streets, he would be carrying a crosspiece. He wouldn't be carrying the full cross like you see in the Passion. He would probably just be carrying the crosspiece, which weighed about 50 to 75 pounds. As he's carrying this thing through the streets, obviously weakened because of everything he's been through. And there would be somebody who would go in front of him as they would have a sign, because this would be his punishment. Now, his punishment wasn't murderer. His punishment wasn't thief. His punishment wasn't insurrectionist. His punishment wasn't anything. Do you know what the sign said? It was the sign that Pilate said to write on the sign. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. That was his crime. The religious leaders said, we have no king but Caesar. And Pilate says, it is written as it is written. What you going to do about it? Nothing. And it infuriated the religious leaders. I put up here because we don't read this in the text. From our perspective, our hearts are like, oh my goodness, what happened? And yet what was not said in the text is exactly what happened. Once the religious leaders got their way, guess what happens? Off to the temple they go. Business as usual. We dealt with him. He's done. He's dead. We don't care anymore. For how many of them did they celebrate the Passover feast that night? Thankful that this thorn in their flesh was dealt with. He's gone. Business as usual. You know, for some of you who have had injustice happen to you, you know, that thing happens and it's stuck and it's left an impression on you. And when others around you just seem to move on and they don't even seem to be affected by it, especially maybe the person who was unjust to you, oh, that just infuriates you. Jesus, while he's hanging on the cross, Joseph of Arimathea, after his death, he would come and he would take him down. Joseph of Arimathea would put him into his tomb. Nicodemus would help him. By the way, these were two members of the Sanhedrin, the very group that put him on the cross. More than likely, Nicodemus and Joseph voted against it. More than likely, but we're never told. But as he goes to the cross, as he's laid in the tomb, obviously Mary, the mother of Jesus, is broken. You know, the disciples, all those, they ran away. Peter, if you remember, he's mourning the loss and so regretting that he denied Jesus 3 times. All those things. And yet for the rest of them, it's just another day in Jerusalem. As I said, at the very end, I would just give you the sermon. But I want to just say one other thing beforehand. In John chapter 1, verse 11, it says this. It says, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. He came to that which was his own. He came to his people, Israel. He came to them. And yet what did they do? They turn on him. They say, crucify him. They don't want him. He came to that which was own, but his own did not receive him. Yet, to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. I hope, it is my hope, certainly my prayer, that every person who's hearing this, whether you're online hearing this or whether you're here today, that every single one of you have received what Jesus has done for you. I would be remiss if I talked about what Jesus did on the cross, the atonement that he made for you. He made us right with God through this. I would be remiss if I didn't say this. This is an opportunity to receive what Jesus has done for you. Don't be like the religious leaders of the day. Don't be like them as they turned their back on him and they said, we don't care about him. Jesus had proven he was the Messiah. There's so many proofs, and I'm telling you, if there's any doubt in your mind, whether online or whatever, if there's any doubt in your mind, trust me, it can be proven Jesus is real. Amen. And he died for you. And he was buried. And what we're going to celebrate next Sunday, he rose again for you, that you could have eternal life. Please, don't let that day go in which you don't receive what Jesus has done. But I know most people here today have received Jesus. And that's why I want to just talk just very briefly here at the end about injustices. Man, we feel it. We feel it when somebody wronged us. And so I want you just to see some things here. How do we entrust our injustices to God? How do I really, when somebody wrongly treats me, when somebody does something to me that's not fair, it's not right, I don't deserve this, how do we handle it? The first thing is this: you need to entrust your response to God. I want you to turn, just please, with me to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. I want to read in this. I'm going to let the text speak rather than me giving you a bunch of sermon stuff, which you don't need. Verse 1. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, how does it feel to be his child? If any comfort from his love, you know what it's like when you feel unlovable and he loves you anyway. If any fellowship with the Spirit, God's Spirit lives inside of you. If any tenderness and compassion, you know what it's like to do something wrong and yet have somebody treat you with compassion. That's what God does. And he says, if you have any of this, then Paul says, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. We can't determine what people do to us. That's up to them. But what I can do is I can entrust my response to God. And even if somebody treats me wrong, even though if somebody's not fair to me, even though they may say something, do something, whatever, that hurts me, I have a choice to make. Am I going to respond as I want to, as my flesh wants to, and get back at them and give them what they deserve? Or am I going to entrust my response back to God? Just what Jesus did for us. The second thing, entrust your reputation to God. Verse 6, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. That word there, grasp, means held on to. I will not let go because I am God the Son. I'm not going to go down there and be humiliated down there because I know that's what's going to happen. And he says, no. I didn't hang on to that deity or that rightful place right next to the Father that the Son certainly had. Instead, it says he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. When Jesus went to the cross, it said he was numbered among the prisoners. There were two criminals who were crucified right next to him. In fact, we didn't read the section there, but one of the criminals said, hey, if you're God, why don't you save yourself? And while you're at it, save us too. Get us off this thing. And then the other criminal says, basically, don't you know who you're talking to? He didn't do anything to deserve it. We're the ones who did. Jesus was hung like a criminal, and yet he surrendered his reputation. Why? Because he knew he surrendered it to God. He entrusted God with it, which leads us to the last one. Entrust your timing to God. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. It feels so wrong to be wronged. And yet, when they wrong you and you say, God, I'm going to give the response that I don't want to give, I don't feel they deserve it, but I'm going to give it because you did it for me. I'm entrusting my response to you. And in the process, I may look like a doormat. I may look like somebody who's weak. I may look like somebody who doesn't care or whatever else. I don't care. I am entrusting my reputation to you, which then says I'm entrusting my timing to God. 1 Peter chapter 5 says, humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up in due time. Are you willing to be wronged so that one day it will show you were right? Are you willing? Are you willing to put yourself out there and say, God, I know if it's up to me and my flesh, I want to exact a pound of flesh right now. But instead, I'm entrusting my injustice to you. Are you willing to entrust your injustices to God? This week, I want you to spend time meditating on two passages. Isaiah 53, we didn't have time to turn there, but you need to read it. It's really good. Do it before Friday, please. Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 12. And then the second one is Philippians 2, 1 through 11. Because that's how we see what Jesus did. And the whole thing is, may your prayer be, make me just like Jesus. Make me just like Jesus for the glory of God. Right now, as the band is going to be coming on up again, we're going to close our service. We're going to close our service by having an opportunity for an altar call. And the altar call is going to be one in which it's going to be a chance for you to say, okay, God, I know I was wronged. I know that what happened maybe wasn't right, but I'm laying it down. I'm giving it back to you. God, I'm entrusting you with my injustice. Maybe it was an ex. Maybe it was a child. Maybe it was a parent. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe what it was. If you want to lay it down, come on down front. Come on down front. We'll have a couple people who'll be willing to come and pray with you if you want it. If you want to lay it down today, today's the day. Jesus did it for you. May you do it for somebody else. After this, I will come and close in prayer, and then we'll close out the service. The altar is now open.
You give life, you are love, you bring light to the dark, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. Sing that again. Give life. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. say great. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Now with one voice, let's declare, all the earth will shout his praise. Come on, church, sing with me. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. Say all the earth, and all the earth will shout your. Our hearts will cry, these bones will. Come on, declare it. Great are you, Lord. Sing it out, all the earth. All the earth will shout your. And our hearts will cry, these bones will shout it out. Great are you, Lord. One more time, sing it out. Say, and all the earth will shout your praise. And our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. So great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. So great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Great are you,
As we wrap up this morning, I just want to thank you all for being here today. Just a reminder, we have our class, Bible class that's going to be taking place right after to help you defend what Jesus did. A lot of people, there's a lot of atheism, there's a lot of agnosticism, a lot of people are saying, I don't know if I can believe this Bible stuff. Trust me, there are answers. And so if you have doubts, questions, you know somebody who may, stick around. It'd be very good for you, 11:15. And then next week, I want to see every chair in here filled, not so that we just make ourselves feel good because we filled the chairs. I'm telling you, the gospel will be presented. And find somebody, think of a neighbor, a friend, a family member, whoever that you can invite. There's little cards back there, the You're Invited cards, if you think is better for that. We have a text message you can send out. We have an email you can forward. Trust me, if you're able to do something, do something. But I want to see every one of you invite somebody to sit with you next week, all right? I've already got people in my mind who I'm going to invite once they're back from spring break today. I'm inviting them today, okay? So you know who you're going to invite this week, all right? We want to just fill it up here next week so that people can hear about grace and truth in Jesus Christ. Amen? All right. I'm going to close in prayer. We're going to go back out and be Jesus, whatever that takes, all right? Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for your love. I thank you for your faithfulness, for how you love us. You are so good to us. You treat us way better than we deserve. Your compassion, your mercy is endless. And Lord, man, there's injustice that's everywhere. And our world seems so keen on justice, and especially social justice and everything. But Lord, you are truly the one who gives justice. And may we be willing to not just receive your justice for us through what you did for us in Jesus, but may we be willing to give mercy and justice out to others as well, because you offer it to us and through us. So, Lord, I just pray you take us, make us your representatives, your ambassadors this week to a world that desperately needs you. In Jesus' name we pray. And all those in agreement said, amen. Have a great week. Bless you all.